Thanks for coming. I'd like to start off with this slide, and before I get into the talk itself, this has kind of been a personal journey for me for almost 23, 24 years with alcohol for me. And for me to really have an understanding, I had to do the thing I'm best at. This has been a journey for me, and I've had to do the best thing I can, and that's research it as much as I possibly can. So for me, and I'll talk about the disease concept, but for me, I have to understand what the biology of it is and how that contributes to addiction. So that's what I'm going to talk about this evening. So the first slide is, everyone recognizes Starry Night with Van Gogh, but that has to do with the myth of the mad genius for one. And at the website given, it's actually free, the article on the myth of the mad genius in Skeptical Inquirer. And the myth of the demon drug is also something I'll get into. So it was believed that Van Gogh drinking absinthe also contained a compound called thujone, which can lead to hallucinations. But it's been discovered recently they've taken pre-1914 or 20, whenever it was banned, bottles that haven't been opened and done gas chromatography mass spec, and they found that instead of there being 350 milligrams of thujone per liter, there's actually only about 25. So Van Gogh wasn't getting his kicks necessarily from the thujone, and absinthe was typically bottled at 45 to 74% alcohol by volume. So he was getting enough of a kick just from the alcohol, and I don't think the thujone really contributed that much. So we might as well start. We're here in North America. This is the American Society of Addiction Medicine and Canadian Society of Addiction definition, short definition of addiction. And if you need more, go to the website. It's on there as well. It goes on for, 3 pages. They call it a disease. We're going to talk about disease concept, but they primarily refer to it as regarding brain reward, motivation theory, and related circuitry. You don't have to read the rest. You can just go to the website. Goes into quite a bit of detail. So I'm not going to be talking a lot about neurobiology. Not that we haven't found some genes, we just don't know how important they are in terms of expression levels, expression in different tissues, in whether they're very overly expressed in the brain, that sort of thing. So when you see an fMRI image, what you're actually seeing is the blood oxygen uptake by that part of the brain because of the flow of blood. So you can say, okay, this part of the brain lights up, but what does that really mean? Does that mean that part of the brain is doing something that affects a behavior? What might be a behavior? We don't really know. It just says that part of the brain is active. So I had this slide. I started this talk when Rob Ford was doing his thing, but long before Philip Seymour Hoffman, unfortunately, died of an overdose. But once again, we have this in the media and the popular media. I wasn't going into this, but the disease theory has been something of an interest of mine for a while. So I'm just briefly, it looks like a complicated slide, but it's not that complicated. I'm briefly going to go into the disease theory. This is nothing new. Back in 1790 to 1830, there was a threefold increase in consumption in the United States. People drink when they started distilling quite a bit. There was the gin craze in the UK, then the foundation of the American Temperance Society, and Benjamin Rush, and I actually have his original publication, a photocopy of it, that he was the first, as far as we know in North America, to determine that alcoholism was a disease. Then we had the Anti-Saloon League, Foundation of the Salvation Army, and then the scientific idea behind addiction caught up in the United States, and they started building asylums for inebriates and so on. And up until this time, we've basically had religious and philanthropic money funneled into the addiction, mostly alcohol process. So in 1920, prohibition in the US didn't work. The mafia got very rich. And then the foundation of AA and the spirituality as a cure for alcoholism, and AA's big book, The 12 Steps. Now there was a gap in there from about mid-1915, somewhere around there, until the middle 30s, where the disease concept essentially vanished, because even in 1914, they were predicting that prohibition was coming to the States, and they were saying people who applied for jobs in the government already had to say they were dry and couldn't get those types of positions. So then in 1940, after publication of the big book with AA, was the new approach. And this was just disease theory reprocessed. And what happened then was when the American Medical Association defined alcoholism as an illness and then as a disease in 1966. That opened up private and some government insurance. And then in 1970, Senator Hughes, who was a longtime member of AA, with Nixon set up the NIAAA, which is the National Institute on Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse. So that opened up the coffers for direct government. And I've indicated this here. This is where we've been going for 40 years, more or less, is round and round with this disease concept of addiction. And I'm going to talk about how or why that has to change. We can't really abandon it, but I'll get there. So alcohol was my problem, and much of the literature out there is on alcohol because it's a legal drug. You don't need a lot of special permits to get it. Funding for looking at illegal drugs is not generally that available. So before I get into the genes, this is how we metabolize ethanol. So this alcohol, it's a very simple molecule, just a couple of the black are carbons, the red is oxygen. And an enzyme comes along. This is the alcohol dehydrogenase. And all it does is it nips that hydrogen up top there off, and it turns it into acetaldehyde, which is rapidly converted to acetate and then to carbon dioxide and water. So that's how we metabolize alcohol. But what's interesting is this is methanol. It's just a carbon and a couple of hydrogens short. And it's also metabolized by the same enzyme. Only what happens when we metabolize methanol is we get formaldehyde, which they use to preserve bodies. And it's extremely toxic, and it's converted to formic acid, and you only need about that much of it in a shot glass to kill you. Now, the interesting part is that during Prohibition in the States, something like 80,000 Americans died because the government would adulterate alcohol being given out legally for research or whatever with methanol. And about 80,000 people died. So just an idea of, this is a really complicated diagram, very simple. This is the main area in the middle, and the process of alcohol breaking down to acetate in the liver mostly. That's where most of the expression of those two enzymes are. But there are direct effects of alcohol as well to forming proteins, to forming fats, and to directly to the cells, and a part of the cells called the endoplasmic reticulum. And it's really, really bad. And over the long term, I would argue that over the long term, alcohol is a really bad drug in terms of damaging. So I'm just going to give a very short history on the genetics of addiction, and this is why we have to be very careful. Because in 1990, the headlines were, wow, gene found for addiction. It was then renamed the reward gene, And Kenneth Bloom has been working on that for ever since 1990. Now he's working on it in terms of whether you're Republican or Democrat. Anyway, I don't know where that's going. But in 2003, the human genome was sequenced. We've got 3 billion base pairs, 20,000 genes. But there's only 0.1% difference between me and anybody else in this room or that was born on the other side of the world. And we know from twin studies and stuff, which are questionable now, that about 50 to 80% of the differences are in alcohol dependence are inherited. What I'm going to talk a bit about is single nucleotide polymorphisms, genome-wide association studies that have been used to try and understand how genes contribute to addiction. So it's very simple. In each cell in your body, except for your germ cells, your sperm or egg cells, you have all the genetic information to make a new you. It just depends on what's turned on, what's turned off, and what's expressed in different parts of your body. So you have all that information in your cell. You have a chromosome. This one actually shows one at metaphase. It's duplicated. And then you have the nucleotides. They're A, G, C, T. Anyway, I'll get a little more into that. So very simply, what we've known about genetics is you have a length of DNA. It's transcribed. There are introns and exons. The introns don't code for anything and they're spliced out. There may be a fundamental reason why they're in there. Then this is the final transcript product is translated into protein, which is then folded. A lot of that's what goes on here, and after the protein is folded, we just don't have any clear idea about. So I included some questions that were asked of me on a discussion group. So the first question was, is addiction a trait that exhibits on a spectrum of severity, or is it more binary? So it's a trait in the sense that it is expressed in the phenotype, such as physical, bodily characteristics, or behaviors, but it results in the expression of multiple genes as polygenic. This applies not only to just alcohol. Not in the sense that a single gene or its variant, an allele, is expressed, so it cannot be binary. There's no way it can be binary. So I'm going to talk about the metabolism genes that we know for sure affect susceptibility to addiction, at least to alcohol, the ones we know for sure. So this is a chromosome 4. We have actually another copy of chromosome 4 of each of our chromosomes, 23. One from 23 from our mother, 23 from our father. But here is just a single chromosome. It could be from the father or mother. And the black bars on the chromosome just indicate how it stains, and then there are different areas indicated. So these are the genes on that part of the chromosome that we know are involved with the metabolism of alcohol. There's a set of 7 genes. You might inherit some, you might inherit all. It's likely that you will inherit most of these together because they occupy such a small part of the chromosome. I won't get into crossing over, but in crossing over, they can be not inherited independently. So they're linked, in other words. So this is only 0.19% of the length of that chromosome. So what does it mean if we have these genes? Well, there's another gene called aldehyde dehydrogenase I showed you. So what happens is we convert alcohol to acetaldehyde and then to acetate. But this alcohol is, it can build up, or it can build up in acetaldehyde. So what happens is we develop an aversion as the acetaldehyde builds up. We get nauseous, we have sweats, so on. So you develop an aversion, and then we have these 2 variants of the ADH1B gene. What they do is they're called protective alleles of the gene. They cause 2 things. One is a higher intrinsic rate for the enzyme to turn it into acetaldehyde, or they have more enzyme to turn the alcohol into acetaldehyde. So that's what those two variants do, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about those. So the ALDH2 converts the acetaldehyde to acetate. This particular version is also distributed throughout the population differently. This is a drug to stop people from drinking. What it does is it completely kills this step. And you get very, very ill if you drink while you're on antabuse. I wouldn't recommend it. So it turns out that the population frequency, and this is getting into population genetics, I don't want to get too much into that, is the frequency of these alleles tend to be higher or lower depending on the population. So if someone says to you, I'm an alcoholic and I metabolize alcohol differently, they may well be telling you the truth, even though they don't know this. So what are single nucleotide polymorphisms? All SNPs are always mutations, but mutations aren't necessarily SNPs. You can have things like insertions, missense, all that kind of stuff. And there are different kinds of SNP mutations. Sometimes an SNP will not cause a change in the protein. Sometimes it will. If it does, then it can cause a disease such as phenylketonuria, or I forget the other one, but there's a few that are caused by a single SNP. So the idea in the last few years in the technology with chip technology and RNA and DNA sequencing and expression is that you look for a person with a single SNP or several SNPs, and you determine who's susceptible to a given disease and who isn't. And that sounds all very well. But is that actually the case? No. These are the genes, and getting back to the question about how predictable is a person's behavior based on genetics, if we look at this, these are the genes whose functions we know. Now tell me where you see there's a behavior in there. There's no behaviors in there. Those code for proteins, enzymes, enzyme modulators, transferases, you name it. There's no behavior in there because we don't understand yet. We can nail the genetics down for, okay, alcoholism genes, some for the neurobiology, but really it gets down to that. So epigenetics has been very much in the news. So I'm going to stop talking directly about genetics now in order to get all of the talk in I want and talk about epigenetics. And that is literally above genetics. And this has to do with heritable changes due to, we know they can go to the third, well, we know for sure they can go to the second generation with animal studies, maybe even the third. But I don't think it's been done yet with animals even to show that it can go to the fourth stage, which would really show that it's inherited beyond the mother, the fetus, and the fetus's germ cells. Also, genes can be methylated. I'm not going to talk about histones, even though the packing of the histone proteins will leave a gene open to transcription and translation. I'll just talk about methylation. So genes, as you develop and grow older, are tagged with methyl groups, that's CH3 groups, and they're only tagged at these sites on the gene at the GC and CG sites when they're, so it's instead of the, anyway, I won't go there. They're only tagged at those sites. And that tells the transcription machinery whether to stop or whether to start transcribing that gene. And so this happens throughout our lives. It happens throughout development. So epigenetics is affected by a lot of things, as we know, diet, toxins, physical activity. Most importantly for addictions is stress. So the goals are, and these are very laudable goals, I'll be very surprised if they're carried out anytime soon. We'll have to identify the methylation patterns. We're a long way from a Gattaca type future where, you instantly your particular genotype is analyzed and everything is known about you. We need to identify the methylation patterns, compare healthy and disease methylation patterns, and understand, and this is huge, understand the interactions between genes, the epigenome, and the environment. So this is where we are. There is no dichotomy here. It always will be environment to some extent. It will be inherited how many genes we have for certain addictions, alcohol and other drug addictions, and they will change in early life, adolescence, and adulthood. And we can no longer say, and I don't like to hear people say, especially in the media, well, it's all because he grew up this way, or it's all because he was born with this. If we start saying, well, people are just born with that, then it's just another way to marginalize them, as far as I'm concerned. They're born that way, they can't help themselves. It's a small step from there to eugenics, sterilization, that sort of thing. Sterilization of people who are considered idiots actually occurred in the States in the 30s. So another question that was asked is, can people who've been addicts in the past be cured, or are they just recovered? Everyone who has been to an AA or an NA meeting will tell you that one drink, one drunk, you're going to go down that road, jails, institutions, or death. But every study that's been done on this, and they've been whacked down by other studies, for every study, the Sobels in the 70s and so on, this 20 to 30% recovery rate keeps popping up. These are people that don't go to meetings. They don't necessarily get treatment, but they end up drinking at least in moderation. And I have, if anyone wants that, I've got lots of stuff on that. The conventional belief in a drug-induced addiction appears to persist, and this is Bruce Alexander, longtime psychologist at Vancouver East Side, Insight, and he's saying it basically serves personal, social, professional, commercial, and political needs. We don't necessarily need to be drug or alcohol, and I'm making that distinction. I don't want to. Drugs and alcohol are the same thing. Alcohol is a drug. We don't say I'm going to the liquor store to pick up a drug. We're going to pick up a bottle or some booze or whatever. And when we go to the prescription counter, we're not necessarily picking up our drugs, we're picking up our medications. But whenever we use the term drug, the automatic thing that comes into our brains is, wow, crackhead, junkie, whatever. I don't agree with that. Is addictive behavior with one substance an indicator of addictive propensity for other substances? Yes, in some cases. And if you substitute with another substance, it can lead to re-addiction. We just don't have the good studies on it yet. But what we do know is with harm reduction does work to some extent. There's been a small study done on Insight in Vancouver. It was only for 8 weeks, 2 weeks before and 6 weeks after Insight opened. So how much can you say? So what I'm also going to get to is that right now, Canadians, 44% of Canadians between 15 and 24 years old do not believe in a god or gods. They're secular. That was a 2012 poll by the Association for Canadian Studies. Now, this question, we don't really know. Because drugs other than alcohol or nicotine are illegal, it's difficult to get them to do money for scientific research. It involves difficult ethical issues. So does alcohol, but not as much as illegal drugs. And mainstream society believes in the demon drug concept. And I'm going to get to that shortly. So this is an example with marijuana. I could use a similar example with heroin, cocaine, or morphine. The information's all out there. It's introduced as a new panacea. Everybody starts buying it, using it. Then society notices some people become addicted. Then it becomes a controlled substance. So you can only get it with government approval. And as people continue to be addicted, even to the controlled substance, then we make it into a demon drug. And I don't know if you've ever seen this movie. It was a must-see movie when I was an undergraduate in the late 70s. And we had to go see this movie. And it's actually quite scary to watch it, looking at it now. So one of the last questions is there a relationship between addiction and obsessive compulsive behavior? The interesting thing about OCD and addiction is about a quarter of those who have been diagnosed with OCD were using drugs before they were officially diagnosed with the OCD. So I don't know whether that means they kind of recognized something was wrong and were self-medicating or what. I don't know, but those are the stats. And that occurs mainly with adolescents, younger people in their teens. As many, also with depression, about 80% of alcoholics complain of depressive symptoms, including 30% who fulfill the criteria for a major depressive disorder. But we don't know which came first, the depression or the alcohol abuse. It's chicken and the egg. And I have all those references if anyone wants them. Are healthy addictions like exercise similar neurochemically to unhealthy associations? Could be. Weightlifters can get hooked on steroids. They can go on special diets, which can cause long-term damage. Runner's high is due to naturally produced endorphins. Nobody really knows. So, conclusions. This will be a little bit controversial. Just as fusion is the energy of the future and always will be, so too the knowledge of genetics of addiction is the cure of the future and always will be. We're never going to find, I don't believe, a cure based on the genetics. Here in North America, it's different than across the Atlantic. Our concept of disease has very much to do with the morality of addiction and the fact that it is sinful almost to be an addict. And we marginalize these people. They are completely out of society. They are what is known as psychosocially, this is Alexander again, psychosocially isolated. So we need to modify this because this has been going on for 40 years, that we've had this current model of the disease concept. Something's got to happen. We've got to untangle it. In every institution you go to, if you have an addiction problem, the first place you're sent to is AA or NA. And you are told there's no other choice. You either go here or you're going to die or you're going to end up in jail. Those are your three options. Nothing else is really explored. Meetings will always be needed just for the peer support group for addicts. So we need to untangle. When you think about it, even in, houses where you can go for 12-step treatment are completely funded under provincial health care and federal health care. And we need to untangle this religiosity or spirituality. I'm saying this as a scientist. I don't have much of either of those. And we need to separate it. We don't need to destroy the disease concept because people seeking treatment, you can die. Alcohol is one of the few drugs that if you've been abusing it for long enough, 1 in 3 people will die if they go cold turkey. So there is going to be a need for people to get treatment to withdraw from alcohol. And so we don't want to take that away, but we've got to start putting money not into the war on drugs and billions and billions and billions of dollars. I'm not saying legalize everything. I don't know what the solution is. Maybe make some things what's it called? They're not illegal, but they're allowed, but not fully legal. I forget the term. So these are the things I think we need to start. We have to stop this 40-year thing of saying, okay, it's a disease. Well, what kind of disease is it? No, it's a habit. It's this or that. It's the other thing. We don't have all the answers. We've got to stop throwing 12-step at it. To me, it's about, it didn't work for me after 20-some years, and it works for about 5% of people. So I'm not going to put it down completely. The actual meetings themselves do have funding difficulties. We also need to change public opinion so that groups like I'm going to talk about in a second. I started up a group here. It had been started up before by a couple of people with CFI. So this is one of the groups. There's another group, and I can send anyone who wants information. There's another major group called SMART, but this is the group that I'm starting in Ottawa. It's completely secular. It's abstinence-based, but I'm not going to kick people out if they happen to be using and they're not, violent or whatever, or abusive. The key word is secular. It's non-spiritual. It's non-religious. It's your choice. If you want to decide that you have a disease that there is no cure for and the only cure is constant abstinence and telling yourself, today I'm sober, tomorrow I might not be, that's your choice. I decide not to believe that. I think, and I don't think it's fair to tell the people I care about that you never know, tomorrow I might walk in there totally shit-faced, sorry. So donations are requested at AA and NA meetings. I'm working with Sean at CFI and other people to get donations. Pamphlets are free or sold. I'm going to have a bunch of stuff up here. So that's SOS, and so far we're doing okay for no advertising. What we need is a little more of that, so that people are aware that they do have a choice. And we're a peer support group. We help each other. So thanks very much. So thanks to the Ottawa Skeptics for giving me the opportunity to speak on an issue that is very close to me and my family. Chris Hebern for his advice, and Dana for all his help in the setup and recording. And Centre for Inquiry Ottawa, Sean especially, and Steve. And everyone I know through CFI who encouraged me to give this talk, and the financial and volunteered time. So one closing thought is, and this is from Charles Darwin, and I really love this line. It refers to the poor, but it can also refer to the poor and the addicted. And as I've discovered, not all people who are panhandling and who are homeless are addicted. Some of them have really bad mental health problems, and they are not addicted. So I love this line. If the misery of the poor be caused not by the laws of natures, but by our institutions, great is our sin. Thanks very much.